Hello, my name is Roxanne New, and I am studying for my Bachelor's of Applied Science with a focus in community interpreting. I'm attending Regis, and this is my capstone. Capstone is entitled Best Practices for Serving Deaf and Hard of Hearing Patients. This video is intended for medical staff to improve awareness and to improve knowledge of what services deaf and hard of hearing people require when they come and visit a doctor, a clinic, or hospital. There are different titles that have been used. Historically, we've noticed that people tend to use a hearing impaired label for people. There is a range of people who are deaf and hard of hearing who experience some hearing loss or the deaf gain, depending on your perspective. There are people who identify with deaf culture. Deaf culture is a separate culture than the American mainstream hearing culture. Deaf culture has its own language, values, and history. There are people who are deaf or hard of hearing or hearing impaired who have some to profound hearing loss that go anywhere on the spectrum from the people who do not identify with deaf culture and people who do. People who identify with deaf culture typically call themselves deaf or hard of hearing. They typically do not appreciate the label of hearing impaired. People on the other end, maybe they don't mind the term hearing impaired. Maybe they prefer hard of hearing or hearing impaired, but understand that there are hard of hearing and profoundly deaf on both ends of the spectrum. Now that we know labels, let's go ahead and discuss how we can best serve people. People who are strongly deaf or follow and identify with deaf culture typically sign. They may read lips and write notes back and forth, but a big factor of deaf culture is sign language, either American Sign Language or an English signing system like Signing Exact English or C. Signing English is not very popular these days. American Sign Language is more common. You will see people who do not identify with deaf culture being signing ASL or signing Exact English, all the way to knowing no sign language and using their voices and reading lips. Now, focusing only on the people who sign and come into a clinic, a hospital, or a doctor's office, we recognize that following the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, that law provides a requirement that any business who is hosting an event or is running a business, that they provide accessibility. You see this with wheelchair ramps and bars on stairs. This also includes deaf and hard of hearing people. Deaf and hard of hearing people would typically need appropriate lighting. They need captions on TVs if they're going to stay in the hospital, access to phone services, which could be the old-fashioned TTY, the TTY, or it could be access to video phones. Typically, people these days have smartphones where they have an app that they just need internet access. They would need a stable internet connection, which means that they might need access to the staff internet connection, unless there's a separate one designated for people and not the general public. They also need access to communication with their hospital staff. They probably need to be able to communicate allergies, previous treatments, what the issue is, and so on. So they need to be able to communicate. Like I said, some of the deaf and hard of hearing people will prefer to read lips and communicate with their mouths, and others will prefer to write back and forth, and still others will prefer a sign language interpreter. Sign language interpreting can go into two different ways. You can have an on-site interpreter or a video remote interpreter, VRI for short. This is a system that you set up. You have a webcam and a dedicated internet connection, which could mean that they have access either to the staff internet connection or a separate internet connection all on their own. They would need this for bandwidth issues. Or you would call an on-site interpreter and they would come and interpret what was going on, the reason that they were there in the clinic or doctor's office or hospital. If you decide to use VRI, here are some things that you should know. VRI typically has a bad bandwidth, or it has before. Sometimes there are successful occurrences with VRI. There's also the issue of being able to hear for the interpreter on the monitor, being able to hear what's going on in the room. And there are issues with angling the camera. There are times when a patient needs to be facing down toward the ground or need to be in sort of an odd positioning where the VRI is not able to make eye contact with the patient. This can cause an interruption in interpreting and can lead to serious happenings. Another issue is that if you have a patient who is passing out or is unable to keep their eyes open, using a VRI could prohibit some interaction between the deaf patient and the interpreter, meaning that some of the communication will suffer. The National Association of the Deaf, or NAD for short, they have made some recommendations. They've recommended that if a hospital, clinic, doctor's office is in a metro area or has easy access to ASL interpreters, that they go ahead and use that resource. If the doctor's office, hospital, or clinic is in a rural area, that they go ahead and use VRI until such time that they can get an interpreter if they are able to. Reasons for this are because of bandwidth issues, connectivity, being able to relay information, positioning, and of course, a live interpreter, on-site interpreter will be able to move per what the staff would need, rather than a VRI who is pretty stable on a cart. I have interviewed two people in my deaf community about their experiences with interpreting services. One had explained that they were going with a deaf friend to a hospital for an emergency situation. The hospital called an interpreter. The interpreter was there in 5 minutes, and everything ran smoothly. This person also recalls a time where they used a VRI, and that was also pretty smooth. Another deaf friend of mine explained that there was one situation where she was going in to visit her family. She was one of the only people who could support her family, so she needed to be there. The hospital called a spoken Spanish language interpreter who did not know sign language. And then when they figured out that that was not an appropriate way to provide services, they called the VRI system down. The VRI system needed to be plugged in. It was not charged. And she was stuck on one corner of the room while all of the action was happening on the other end. The interpreter was not able to hear what was going on and was not able to interpret very clearly. She was not able to be close to her family members in the hospital. As you can see, that can be a problem. I've heard recommendations from those two friends. They recommend that people on staff, medical staff, are able and trained and proficient in sign language, or that an on-site interpreter be on staff so that you have someone you are able to call down. Or just please go ahead and call a sign language interpreter. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you so much. Please see the attached information below.